The morning of June 30th, 1940, 1100 hours exactly. A single Spitfire tears across the English Channel at 30,000 feet, and if you'd been standing on the cliffs of Dover, watching it climb into that summer sky, you might have thought someone had lost their mind, because this fighter, this solitary, unarmed reconnaissance plane, was painted the color of a baby's nursery. Pale pink, almost absurdly so. Its destination, the German naval base at Lorient in Brittany, freshly seized by Wehrmacht forces just 11 days earlier. The pilot officer George Patterson Christie of the Photographic Development Unit, was flying what any rational military strategist would call a suicide mission. One fighter, no guns, painted in a shade that screamed visibility, deep into Nazi-occupied France in broad daylight. Every rule said Christie should be dead before he made it home. He wasn't. Christie photographed the entire base, captured every installation, every dock, every defensive position, and flew back to England without a single German fighter, laying eyes on him. Not because he got lucky, because he was invisible. That ridiculous pink paint, officially designated Camouflage Pink, later refined to PRU Pink, had turned his Spitfire into a ghost. At dawn and dusk, when the atmosphere glows with scattered ultraviolet light and clouds sit low on the horizon, that pale finish didn't just blend in. It vanished. The very trait that seemed guaranteed to get pilots killed was exactly what kept them alive. The Germans were scanning the sky for blue-gray fighters against blue-gray heavens. Nobody thought to look for pink. This wasn't some desperate gamble or a coat of paint slapped on optimistically. This was optical physics turned into a weapon, developed by an eccentric Australian entrepreneur named Sidney Cotton, refined through brutal trial and error, and proven in the blood of reconnaissance pilots who flew what they grimly called dicing missions, as in dicing with death. And the principle behind it would shatter everything air forces thought they understood about camouflage. When Britain declared war on September 3rd, 1939, the RAF's photo reconnaissance capabilities were catastrophically inadequate. The standard approach relied on Bristol Blenheim bombers, slow, vulnerable, bristling with defensive guns that advertised their military purpose to every German fighter within visual range. In the first 4 months of war, RAF reconnaissance aircraft photographed 2,500 square miles of occupied Europe. The cost, roughly for the aircraft lost, most of them Blenheims. That's one aircraft down for every 63 square miles photographed. At that rate, mapping Hitler's Fortress Europe would bleed the RAF white. Enter Sidney Cotton. The Australian aviation pioneer had already been conducting clandestine photo reconnaissance flights over Germany using a civilian-registered Lockheed 12A Electra before the shooting even started. Cotton had proven a radical theory that contradicted every military doctrine of the day. Speed and altitude could replace armor and guns. An unarmed aircraft flying at 30,000 feet and pushing 390 miles per hour could simply outrun interception. The trick was staying invisible long enough to get past the threat before anyone noticed you were there. On October 16, 1939, Cotton convinced Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding to release 2 precious Spitfire markers from Fighter Command. These weren't just any Spitfires. They were stripped down to nothing but speed and endurance. All 8 303 Browning machine guns. Gone. Ammunition boxes. Deleted. Armor plating behind the pilot. Discarded. Radio sets. Pulled out to save weight. The gun ports were filled flush with plaster of Paris and polished mirror smooth. Extra fuel tanks went in behind the pilot and beneath the wings. F-24 cameras with 8-inch lenses replaced the inner wing guns. What emerged was a reconnaissance platform that could hit 390 miles per hour at altitude, fast, enough to outrun the Messerschmitt Bf-109E, which topped out around 354 at 20,000 feet. But speed alone wouldn't save you. The aircraft still had to avoid being spotted in the first place. Cotton's first photo reconnaissance Spitfires wore what he called camouflage green, a pale, light shade intended for high-altitude work. On November the 18th, 1939, Flight Lieutenant Maurice Shorty Longbottom took Spitfire and Throw 71 on the first-ever RAF Spitfire reconnaissance sortie, flying from Seclin in France to photograph Aachen, Germany, from 33,000 feet. The mission succeeded, but it revealed a fundamental problem. Different altitudes and lighting conditions demanded different camouflage strategies. At high altitude, above 25,000 feet, aircraft appeared as dark silhouettes against bright sky when seen from below, or as dark specks against clouds when viewed from above. At medium and low altitude, between 5 and 15,000 feet, atmospheric haze became the dominant factor, and at dawn and dusk, when the sun hung low on the horizon, the entire sky took on a peculiar pinkish glow from ultraviolet light reflecting off clouds and moisture in the air. This is where physics becomes counterintuitive. The human eye doesn't see objects directly. It sees reflected light. An aircraft's visibility depends not on its actual color, but on how much contrast it creates against its background. Dark green or gray-blue camouflage works beautifully against clear daytime sky, but against the rosy atmospheric haze of dawn or dusk, or against low cloud cover lit by the rising or setting sun, those sensible colors create harsh contrast. They show up as dark spots against a lighter backdrop. Pink, however, matches the wavelength of light scattered by atmospheric particles during low sun conditions. The color wasn't chosen randomly. It was mixed to match the specific hue of diffused sunlight at dawn and dusk. The formula preserved in RAF archives specified 1 part red, using standard RAF roundel red, to 10 parts white. The result was what those who mixed it described as a very pale pink-white. So subtle it appeared almost white unless held directly against a white card. This wasn't Mountbatten pink, the brighter shade the Royal Navy used on destroyers and landing craft. PRU Pink was far paler, chosen specifically for the conditions reconnaissance Spitfires encountered, flying at medium altitude, typically 5 to 15,000 feet, beneath or against cloud cover during the hours when German defenses struggled to track aircraft visually. The Photographic Development Unit, redesignated No. 1 Photographic Reconnaissance. Unit on November 14, 1940, established a detachment at Porthcawl in Cornwall, specifically to photograph German naval installations at Brest. These missions earned the designation dicing, short for dicing with death, because they required pilots to fly low and slow over heavily, defended targets while maintaining precise courses for camera. Operations Flight Lieutenant Keith Arnold, commanding the flight, watched pilot after pilot fail to return from Brest. In one particularly sobering incident, Arnold requested replacement pilots from RAF Benson. 2 arrived, took off for Brest that evening, and neither one came back. The losses mounted. 5 pilots gone in quick succession, photographing the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, and the dock facilities the Kriegsmarine was rapidly fortifying. The pink Spitfires represented a calculated gamble. They sacrificed high altitude and visibility, where they appeared noticeably lighter than PRU blue aircraft, for protection at medium and low altitude. Pilots flew these missions during the golden hours, when the sun hung low and cast that characteristic pinkish glow across the sky. The aircraft became part of the atmospheric haze, rather than contrasting against it. Consider one account preserved in reconnaissance records. When coming out of the clouds at 3,300 feet, he encountered a pair of Bf-109s, which passed some 50 yards away from him. Fortunately, the Germans failed to notice him. 50 yards. That's roughly the length of a cricket pitch. The Messerschmitts flew close enough that the pilots should have easily identified the Spitfire's distinctive elliptical wings. But against cloud-filtered dawn light, the pink paint rendered the reconnaissance aircraft effectively invisible. The color's effectiveness extended beyond simply matching atmospheric haze. Pale colors, white, very light pink, very pale blue, have a secondary optical effect. They reduce the apparent size of an object in hazy conditions. This principle, well understood by optical physicists, works because pale colors scatter light similarly to atmospheric particles. The aircraft's edges blur into the surrounding haze, making size and distance difficult to judge. This same principle led RAF, Coastal Command, and the U.S. Navy to adopt white undersurfaces for anti-submarine aircraft, reducing the distance at which U-boat crews could spot approaching threats. Standard military camouflage theory in 1940 emphasized matching terrain when viewed from above for bombers, or matching sky when viewed from below for fighters. Reconnaissance aircraft broke this model completely. They needed to be invisible from all angles, at variable altitudes, across changing light conditions. No single color could accomplish everything. Instead, specialized schemes were developed for specific operational profiles. PRU Blue, a darker, more saturated blue, was sanctioned for high-altitude work in October 1941, though it had been in unofficial use earlier. At 30,000 feet and above, PRU Blue aircraft blended into the deep blue of high-altitude sky. PRU Pink, conversely, was optimized for low-altitude missions below 15,000 feet, particularly when cloud base was low and the sun angle was shallow. In North Africa and the Far East, where atmospheric conditions differed dramatically from the European maritime climate, Reconnaissance Spitfires used overall royal blue instead. The pilots themselves often despised the pink paint. It violated every instinct they had. One pilot recalled thinking the aircraft stuck out like a sore thumb when taxiing or parked on the airfield. The planes looked absurd, unmilitary, even embarrassing. But combat results proved the scheme's value. While exact loss rates comparing pink versus blue Spitfires weren't separately documented, the PRU as a whole suffered some of the highest casualty ratios of any RAF unit, while simultaneously achieving extraordinary results. From November 1939 through spring 1940, Cotton's small fleet of modified Spitfires, never more than a handful operational at any time, photographed 5,000 square miles without losing a single aircraft. That perfect record didn't last forever, of course. On April 10, 1941, Pilot Officer William Kenneth Manifold took off from Porthcawl at 17:30 hours in Spitfire P9396 for a reconnaissance mission to Brest. He was intercepted and shot down by Lieutenant Eric Hohagen of 2JG. 26 at 19:25 hours, coming down in the English Channel north of Ushant. Neither his body nor the aircraft wreckage was ever recovered. It was Hohagen's second PRU Spitfire kill that day. But for every pilot lost, dozens completed missions that would have been impossible in standard camouflage. The key was matching the operational profile to the paint scheme. Pink Spitfires didn't fly at high noon on clear days. That wasn't their mission. They flew at dawn, at dusk, in marginal weather with low cloud, when atmospheric conditions transformed that pale pink into perfect camouflage. What made the pink Spitfire work wasn't the color alone. It was the entire operational system built around understanding when and how the color provided protection. This required three elements working in concert. First, the right color. The shade had to match atmospheric light conditions, not terrain, not clear sky. Cotton and his team understood that cameras see differently than human eyes, and that atmospheric haze at low altitude during low sun angle creates specific light wavelengths. That 1:10 ratio of red to white wasn't arbitrary. It matched the observed color of UV light reflection off clouds and moisture. Second, altitude had to be precisely managed. Too high, and the pink Spitfire became too light against darker sky. Too low, and atmospheric haze couldn't provide concealment. The sweet spot was 5 to 15,000 feet. Altitudes where most German anti-aircraft fire was less accurate and where fighter interceptions required more time to coordinate. Third, timing was critical. Dawn missions launched when the sun sat 10 to 15 degrees above the horizon, creating maximum atmospheric scattering. Dusk missions timed return flights for similar conditions. Cloud cover was preferred, not solid overcast, which would obscure targets, but broken cloud at 3 to 10,000 feet that provided both concealment and UV reflection. The Spitfire platform itself contributed to the system's success. The Merlin engine's two-stage supercharger allowed rapid altitude changes. Climb to 30,000 feet to cross the channel undetected. Dive to medium altitude over the target for photography. Climb back to safety for the return flight. The aircraft's speed meant German fighters had limited time to intercept, even if they spotted the intruder. The polished skin reduced drag and, more importantly, prevented ice crystal formation that could make the aircraft glitter in sunlight. Compare this to German reconnaissance doctrine. The Luftwaffe used fast bombers like the Junkers Ju-86P and Ju-88, which relied on altitude alone for protection. These aircraft flew at 40,000 feet and above, where atmospheric density made interception difficult. But they were large, relatively slow, and created significant visual signatures. British fighters eventually developed high-altitude variants like the Spitfire HF-7, with extended wingtips specifically to counter these threats. On August 28, 1942, a single Ju-86R bombing Bristol from 42,000 feet killed 48 people. RAF high-altitude Spitfires subsequently intercepted and shot down several Ju-86Rs at extreme altitude, ending the German high-altitude bombing campaign. The PRU approach was more sophisticated. Use multiple altitudes, multiple camouflage schemes, and precise timing to make detection nearly impossible. High-altitude work, use PRU blue. Low-altitude work, use PRU pink. The aircraft themselves were modified for specific roles, some optimized for range. The PR Mark IV could carry 114 gallons of internal fuel, others for low-level oblique photography, the PR Mark V with side-mounted cameras, and others for medium-altitude work, where pink camouflage provided optimal concealment. Creating an effective reconnaissance, Spitfire required removing approximately 450 pounds of military equipment and adding back 200 pounds of cameras and fuel. The weight savings translated directly into performance gains. A standard Spitfire MI fighter carried 8 303 Browning machine guns, roughly 140 pounds total, 2,400 rounds of ammunition, approximately 190 pounds. Armor plating behind the pilot, about 73 pounds. Full radio equipment, roughly 50 pounds. Strip all of it out, and you've freed up significant weight. That savings increased maximum speed by approximately 18 miles per hour, and, more critically, extended range by roughly 50%. The PR Type B, introduced in February 1940, carried an additional 29-gallon fuel tank behind the pilot, raising total capacity to about 114 gallons. At economical cruise speed of 210 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, this gave the aircraft an endurance of roughly 3.5 hours and a range of approximately 735 miles. The PR Mark IV, which entered service in October 1940, pushed range even further by utilizing fuel tanks built into the wing leading edges. Total fuel capacity reached 229 gallons, enough for 7-hour missions covering 2,000 miles. On one of the PR Semikai's first sorties, a reconnaissance, Spitfire reached Stettin on the Baltic coast and returned to England, a round trip exceeding 1,400 miles. The cameras themselves were precision instruments requiring careful management. The F-24 camera, with an 8-inch focal-length lens, could capture images from 30,000 feet, showing details as small as 3 feet across. The F-52, with a 36-inch focal-length lens, basically a telephoto lens the size of a small telescope, could resolve details under 2 feet from high altitude. But these cameras faced 2 critical problems. fogging at high altitude due to temperature differentials, and vibration from the aircraft's structure. Cotton solved the fogging problem by routing warm air from the engine's cooling system through ducting that blew across the camera lenses, preventing condensation. This innovation, developed during his pre-war clandestine flights over Germany in the Lockheed Electra, became standard on all PRU aircraft. The vibration problem required mounting cameras on rubber shock absorbers and ensuring the pilot maintained absolutely steady flight during camera runs. Even a small deviation from straight and level flight could mean missing the target entirely. The pilot's job during reconnaissance missions was extraordinarily demanding. Flying solo. No radio communication. Early PRU Spitfires had radios removed to save weight. For up to 7 hours in a cramped, unheated cockpit, the reconnaissance pilot had to navigate by dead reckoning, maintain precise altitudes and courses, operate cameras, watch for enemy fighters in the rearview mirror, monitor for contrails that would betray his position, and manage fuel carefully enough to make it home. Navigation errors could be fatal. Several PRU pilots simply vanished over the North Sea or Channel, presumably lost after missing their return navigation points. The pink paint itself required specific handling. It was applied in multiple thin coats over polished aluminum surface, then buffed to a semi-gloss finish that minimized drag while maintaining the correct optical properties. The paint dried to a matte finish naturally, so achieving semi-gloss required careful polishing with fine abrasive. Too glossy and the aircraft would glint in sunlight. Too matte and it would appear darker than optimal. Maintenance crews developed techniques for touching up paint damage without disrupting overall color consistency. Interestingly, the exact shade of PRU Pink varied slightly over time. Initial batches, mixed according to Cotton's formula, produced what observers described as almost white with a pinkish tinge. Later production batches, when PRU Pink became more standardized, produced a slightly more saturated pink. Neither matched the bright Barbie pink that some modern model kits and restored aircraft display. Contemporary photographs of pink Spitfires, when analyzed carefully, accounting for the orthochromatic and panchromatic film stocks used in the 1940s, consistently show a very pale color, noticeably lighter than aluminum, but clearly not pure white. The intelligence gathered by pink Spitfires directly influenced major military operations. In May 1940, a PRU Spitfire photographed approximately 400 German tanks concealed under camouflage netting and trees in the Ardennes forest, revealing the concentration point for the Wehrmacht's breakthrough that would bypass the Maginot Line and split Allied forces. The photographs showed tank formations, supply depots, and fuel stocks that confirmed German intentions to attack through terrain military theorists considered impenetrable for armored formations. On February 22, 1941, Flying Officer William Kenneth Manifold flew a dicing mission specifically requested by Dr. R.V. Jones, the British Scientific Intelligence Officer. The target? A German radar installation, specifically a Freya early warning radar near the French coast. Manifold's photographs provided the first clear images showing the radar's characteristic dish, antenna, and support equipment. These images allowed British scientists to understand German radar capabilities and develop countermeasures. After completing his photographic run, Manifold, in violation of PRU doctrine, but demonstrating the aggressive spirit of reconnaissance pilots, strafed the radar station, damaging it enough to render it temporarily inoperative. The most critical reconnaissance work focused on German naval facilities at Brest, where the battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau posed a massive threat to Atlantic convoys. Pink Spitfires flew repeated dicing missions over Brest, photographing the ship's positions, defensive arrangements, and battle damage from RAF bombing raids. These oblique photographs, taken from low altitude with side-mounted cameras, show details impossible to capture from high altitude. Dock configurations, anti-aircraft gun positions, camouflage netting patterns. and whether the ships were actually combat-ready or undergoing repairs. In December 1943, photographs taken by PRU aircraft allowed Constance Babington-Smith, a British photo interpreter, to identify a V-1 flying bomb on a test stand at Peenemünde, Germany. The discovery confirmed intelligence reports about German secret weapons and triggered Operation Crossbow, a massive Allied bombing campaign targeting V-weapon production and launch facilities. Without those photographs, the V-1 campaign against Britain might have achieved complete surprise. The Möhne Dam, target of the famous Dambusters raid in May 1943, was extensively photographed by PRU Spitfires before and after the attack. The pre-raid photographs showed water levels, dam structure, and defensive positions. The post-raid photographs proved the raid's success, showing water pouring through breached dam walls and flooding downstream valleys. These images were used immediately for bomb damage, assessment, and subsequently for historical documentation of what remains one of the most audacious raids of the war. Throughout the war, PRU Spitfires flew approximately 16,000 operational sorties, providing an estimated 80% of all Allied intelligence gathered in Europe. The unit suffered loss rates among the highest of any RAF organization, testament to the extreme danger of flying alone, unarmed, deep into enemy territory. Yet the intelligence gathered proved invaluable. As one RAF officer put it, "We sent the bombers where the PRU told us to. Without reconnaissance, we'd have been bombing blind." The PRU's combat record reveals the ruthless mathematics of aerial reconnaissance. From November 1940 to October 1942, when No. 1 PRU was disbanded and reorganized into 5 separate squadrons, Nozon 540, 541, 542, 543, and 544, the unit lost approximately 50 aircraft and pilots on operations. That's roughly 1 loss per 320 sorties, a casualty rate of 0.31% per sortie. Compare this to Bomber Command's overall loss rate of approximately 3.8% per sortie during the same period. Reconnaissance pilots flew far fewer missions than bomber crews, but each mission penetrated deep into enemy territory without the protection of formation flying or defensive armament. The dicing missions, low-altitude reconnaissance flights over heavily defended targets, carried particularly high risk. These missions required pilots to fly predictable, steady courses at altitudes where anti-aircraft fire was most accurate and fighter interception easiest to coordinate. The pink camouflage provided concealment but not protection. If spotted, the unarmed reconnaissance Spitfire had only speed and maneuverability for defense. Several factors contributed to the PRU's survivability, despite these challenges. First, reconnaissance pilots were selected from the most experienced fighter pilots. Then, given extensive additional training in navigation, camera operation, and tactics for avoiding detection and escape. Second, missions were planned meticulously, using the latest intelligence about German fighter dispositions, radar coverage, and anti-aircraft defenses. Third, aircraft were maintained to higher standards than typical fighter squadrons. Engine reliability was critical when flying 7-hour missions over enemy territory. The specialized camouflage schemes worked. While exact figures comparing pink versus blue aircraft losses don't exist in surviving records, anecdotal evidence from pilots' memoirs and after-action reports consistently describe pink aircraft completing missions during dawn and dusk hours, with fewer interception attempts than aircraft in other camouflage schemes during similar timeframes. The optical physics worked as designed. When used in the correct environmental conditions, pink made the aircraft extraordinarily difficult to detect. One metric stands out particularly. During the period when Cotton's small flight of modified Spitfires operated from France, November 1939 to May 1940, covering approximately 5,000 square miles of enemy territory, not a single aircraft was lost to enemy action. The flight evacuated ahead of German advances during the fall of France. with one aircraft damaged in an air raid at Heston Aerodrome in September 1940. But operational losses during active reconnaissance missions? Zero. This perfect record derived from Cotton's understanding that camouflage, speed, altitude, and timing formed an integrated system, not individual features. The Pink Spitfire succeeded because it rejected orthodox military thinking about camouflage in favor of optical physics. Standard camouflage. Theory assumed aircraft needed to match terrain when viewed from above, or sky when viewed from below. This thinking optimized camouflage for specific viewing angles under specific conditions. The PRU approach recognized that reconnaissance aircraft operated under variable conditions, multiple altitudes, different times of day, changing weather, and viewing angles from multiple directions. No single camouflage pattern could optimize for all conditions. Instead, multiple specialized schemes were developed, each optimized for specific operational profiles. High-altitude work got PRU Blue. Low-altitude work in European maritime climate got PRU Pink. Low-altitude work in North African desert got Royal Blue. Each scheme matched its operational environment. This approach required understanding that human vision and the mechanical vision of cameras depends on contrast, not absolute color. An object becomes visible when it contrasts with its background. The pink paint didn't hide the Spitfire by making it blend with terrain or sky directly. It hid the Spitfire by matching the scattered light wavelengths present in atmospheric haze during low sun conditions. The aircraft disappeared not by looking like something else, but by looking like nothing, like empty atmosphere. The Royal Navy reached similar conclusions independently, painting destroyers and landing craft in Mountbatten pink, a brighter, more saturated pink than PRU pink for Mediterranean operations. The long-range desert group used pink-painted trucks and Land Rovers in North Africa. In each case, the logic was identical. Pale pink matches the scattered light present in desert haze and early morning or evening atmospheric conditions better than any other color. Modern militaries still apply these principles. During the 1991 Gulf War, RAF Jaguar, Buccaneer, and Tornado GR-1 aircraft were painted in a pink-tinted desert camouflage scheme that echoed the PRU approach. The color helped aircraft blend with desert heat haze, and dust clouds kicked up by operations. Fighter. Pilots reported difficulty spotting friendly aircraft painted in the pink-tinted scheme even at relatively close range during low-altitude operations. The fundamental lesson. Effective camouflage requires understanding the specific conditions under which the object will be observed. No camouflage works everywhere. The pink Spitfire worked brilliantly in its operational niche, medium altitude, dawn-dusk timing, maritime, atmospheric conditions, and would have been disastrously visible in other conditions. The genius wasn't the color itself. The genius was matching the color precisely to the mission profile.